Hello there, heroes. I'm the Orange Ranger, and I guess this really is it, the end of the road, at least for now. In this video, I'll be taking a look back at the first and currently only officially announced season of Power Rangers Hyperforce. The characters, the themes, and the impact that this crazy little experiment has had in becoming a beloved part of the Power Rangers franchise. I'm going to start things off by attempting a quick summary of the story of Power Rangers Hyperforce, just to get everybody on the same page. Power Rangers Hyperforce takes place about 17 to 18 years after the events of Power Rangers Time Force, starting in the future of Time Force in the year 3017/3018 and wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff. Jen Scotts, the pink Time Force Ranger, is now a history professor at the Time Force Academy. During one of her classes, there's suddenly an attack on the Academy, and she finds herself watching over 3 of her students, Marv, Eddie, and Vesper. Meanwhile, another student, Chloe, is trying to break into an evidence room when she's caught by a Time Force beat cop, Jack, who means to turn her into the school's dean. However, they then see that dean trying to kill Jen and the other students, and he helps to incapacitate the dean, and the group investigates the school. They discover a shadowy conspiracy revolving around an organization known only as the Alliance, whose goal is evil. The group is separated from Jen, finding her later in the time ship bay, fighting a powerful and shadowy creature who for the vast majority of the series we only knew of as the Alliance leader. She is defeated and injured, but left alive as the Alliance takes several time ships and flees into the time stream. She sends this ragtag team of Time Force cadets and one Time Force beat cop over to a brand new time ship to pursue them, and this brand new time ship has 2 pretty key advantages. The first is that this new ship has access to a dimension known as the Hyperstream, where time and space are combined, meaning that they can travel anywhere and anytime at once. Whereas the models the Alliance use are limited to only traveling through time, having to then exit the time stream and travel through space, physical space, to get to the location that they want to go. The second is that stored on this time ship is a box of morphers, empowering this group to become the next generation of Time Force Rangers, the Hyperforce Rangers. This is something that was never really directly touched on during the show, but the Hyperforce Rangers, like the Megaforce Rangers, use cards to access their powers, inserting the cards into wrist-mounted morphers to do things like morph, access weapons, summon Zords, etc. The Rangers chase the Alliance leader throughout Ranger history as he adds to his forces with a familiar face, Scorpina, explaining her disappearance in 1995, as well as an unfamiliar face, Velkanos, an original villain character. They eventually find Joe, Red Ranger Marv's brother, as well as the Silver Time Force Ranger. He would lose those powers, but then Jen would make him this team's 6th Ranger, making him the Green Hyperforce Ranger. The Rangers have their final confrontation with the Alliance leader in 1998, pursuing him to the Sumerian planet for the most evil dinner party in history. It was, by the way, pointed out to me that that evil dinner party did not take place on the moon, as I had said. It was on the Sumerian planet, and that is accurate, though during the final episodes of Hyperforce I could have sworn that they had said they were on the moon. The Alliance leader is revealed to be Thrax, the son of Rita Repulsa and Lord Zed that was seen on Power Rangers Operation Overdrive. He kills Dark Spectre and helps the Alliance kidnap Zordon before the Rangers finally destroy him. By the way, this was one of those cases where it turns out the villain that we had followed the entire time was not the true villain. There was someone behind the curtain pulling the strings. And that man turned out to be Mr. Ashford, Chloe, the Pink Ranger's father. He leads the Rangers on a chase for the Time Force Rangers, giving him time to escape with a protected Zordon, thus changing history. The Hyperforce Rangers return to the future, for them the present, a time where evil has won and taken power, and good is just a small resistance cell led by Jen Scotts. The Time Force Rangers decide to stay in 3018 and help this resistance, while the Hyperforce Rangers go back into time to search for Zordon, having just 8 months though I don't know what a time limit means to time travelers, to set things as right as they can to rewrite history the way we all remember it. 8 paragraphs to summarize 25 3-hour sessions? Not all that bad, especially from me, all things considered. There is a lot of stuff I glossed over. They met Santa Claus. They met Tommy Oliver. More than once, technically speaking, but that's a very general overview of the big important points of the story. Now, I want to go through each of the characters, because as good as the plot was, it was really the rich character development that set Hyperforce apart as a season of Power Rangers. And where else can we start with that but with the team's intrepid Red Ranger, Marv. Marv's biggest character trait throughout the season is being a deferring Red Ranger. For much of the series, he insists that the Hyperforce Rangers are actually a leaderless team, even citing this as an advantage over the SPD A Squad Rangers during a battle with them. Marv's feeling was that anyone could step up and lead the team if they were feeling the inspiration at that moment. Marv is driven for most of the season by the apparent death of his brother, Joe, a covert Time Force officer as the Silver Ranger, who disappeared, and Time Force told his parents that Joe had died. Marv was unsatisfied with their investigation, and this is something a little bit shaky that I don't think was ever explained all that well, managed to use the badge that the Time Force officers returned to his family to hack into Time Force's database and list himself as a graduated cadet ready for field duty. Marv became a Time Force officer with nobody apparently asking any questions about this, and he was partnered with Jack, who would eventually become the Yellow Ranger. However, as the two grew to trust each other, Marv admitted his secret to Jack, and Jack, feeling an obligation to duty, reported it to Time Force's superiors. However, it was Jack's good word that allowed Marv not to just be kicked out of the academy, but simply readmitted and allowed to retake his academy courses and graduate properly. Now, what I'm about to mention is actually a very major spoiler for Hyperforce's story, so I feel like this is a good place to insert a general spoiler warning. If you don't know anything about this story, I would very strongly recommend that you go and watch Hyperforce on HyperRPG, or at the very least, if you can't do that, don't have the time or whatever, watch my Hyperforce session reviews to get the story in its full context so details like this don't spoil you. Here we go. It was the death of Vesper, the Black Ranger, that finally convinced Marv to step forward and take full responsibility as the leader of the Hyperforce Rangers. Now that sounds odd. The ultimate failure for a Ranger team leader, the death of a Ranger, convincing him to take responsibility as a leader. But that's exactly what happened. Taking responsibility for Vesper's death is what showed him that he needed to take responsibility for all of the team's actions. After this, he was a bit bolder in leading his team forward, but he was still open to suggestions from the other Rangers. Marv was portrayed by Peter Sudarso, best known as the currently standing Blue Ranger Preston on Power Rangers Super Ninja Steel. And it was interesting having Peter portray Preston and Marv at the same time because it pointed out some of my glaring issues with the writing and direction of Ninja Steel and Super Ninja Steel. Because while Preston is an incredibly flat character who's just a list of informed character attributes, Marv was nuanced and rich with all sorts of character notes and interwoven aspects to his personality. The acting difference between Preston, which was a directed performance, and Marv, where Peter was directing the performance, is night and day. Jack Dealgood Thomas, Time Force, serial number 1993 Omega Gamma. Jack started out as a Time Force beat cop, a man that just wanted to do his job, the Chief O'Brien of the Hyperforce Rangers. When we first meet Jack, he's pacing back and forth in front of the Academy, mumbling to himself, resenting the fact that he has to speak to Academy students about being a Time Force officer. He just wants to do his job. Jack becoming a Ranger was definitely a case of fate leading him to the exact right spot at the right time, as he catches Chloe breaking into the evidence room, which leads him into the confrontation with the Dean, which leads him into the whole situation, getting on the time ship and becoming the Yellow Ranger. For much of the early part of the season, there's heavy tension between Marv and Jack, with both of them knowing that Jack was responsible for getting Marv demoted back to the Academy. However, Marv feels like that Jack was entirely behind that, trying to get him kicked out of the Academy for lying, and it was only the mercy of the board of directors that allowed him to stay, when really it was the other way around. When the two of them finally talk and hash it out, Marv can see that Jack actually did the right thing and had his best interest in mind, and it was Marv who made the mistake by lying and trying to take a shortcut in the first place. Jack is just a really cool character to have in the Power Rangers universe for two main reasons: his age and his size. I don't believe it's ever established during Hyperforce exactly when Jack graduated from the Time Force Academy. It is established that he had been a Time Force beat cop for a while, and that he was a regular cop before joining the Time Force, so some time had clearly passed. If we equate Jack's age anywhere near the age of his actor, Paul Schreier, he could be as old as 48 years old. By the by, can you believe that Paul Schreier is 48 years old? And the other aspect, his size, even when we look at the drawings of Jack Dealgood Thomas, which show what he actually looks like, he's a bigger, heavy-set guy. And for somebody like me, it's always great to see that heavies can be Power Rangers. Flawless segue, Jack was portrayed by Paul Schreier, best known for having played Bulk in multiple iterations of Power Rangers. Older fans were thrilled to get to see Paul finally portray a Power Ranger, even though most of it was left to our imagination, and we had to deal with a bunch of people going, Bulk is finally a Power Ranger! Bulk was not a Power Ranger. Jack is not Bulk. In fact, Paul seemed to take the opportunity to craft basically the polar opposite of Bulk for a character in Jack: professional, stoic, and quite frankly, annoyed by antics. The nerd of the team was Eddie, the Blue Ranger, and conveniently enough, Eddie was a Ranger history nerd, making him the one that would fill the rest of the team in on a Ranger team's history when they needed to travel to that particular era. Eddie wasn't always accurate about his history in other aspects. For example, in an early episode, he has some really strange ideas about Halloween, but he was enthusiastic and eager, a tall, lanky fighter who was just as ready to go out and fight some bad guys as he was to geek out about the Power Rangers. Much of Eddie's arc and character motivation ties directly into Vesper, the Black Ranger. There was a romantic connection between the two that was hinted at throughout the series, though never really resolved, to be honest, though the two of them do eventually admit that they love each other. He is therefore the one most impacted by her immediate death after that, and that was really a heartbreaking arc for the series. Eddie was portrayed by Andre Meadows, aka Black Nerd Comedy, on YouTube. It was amazing watching Andre evolve as an actor with Eddie, and eventually he was a real show stealer, dominating scenes that he was in with emotion and gravitas and not just comedy. And another flawless segue that brings us to Vesper, the Black Ranger, who really has one of the most interesting and involved arcs over the entire season. Early on, Vesper is the team's jokester, a very strange woman who's quick with the one-liners and the silliness. But then, the Hyperforce Rangers end up visiting Corinth in the dimension of RPM, and Vesper ends up infected with the Venjix virus, revealing both to herself as well as her teammates that she is actually a biomech android. From that point on, Vesper tries to stay silly and lighthearted, but it's clear that she's having some major personal issues about her identity. She absolutely dominates what was really a pretty quiet, plot-driven episode where the Rangers return home to kind of rest and recover and visit their families. She discovers that she was created by Dr. Louis Ferrix, aka Frax, and even finds an android family bent on revenge against Rancic for killing Frax, even though he had redeemed since then, and she has to convince them that there's a better way. The final arc of the show leading into the story's conclusion is Vesper's death, and the amazing thing about that is this was a live RPG airing every week. It's not something that you could exactly plan for. When Vesper was actually killed by the Alliance leader, Malika, the game's runner, I'm going to talk about her a little bit later, insisted that she rolled for the Alliance leader the exact number of damage points equal to Vesper's remaining hit points. It wasn't a given that Vesper was going to die. This was not a story that was written. And yet, that random occurrence led to one of the show's best arcs. The flip side of that is that this also wasn't just some weekly D&D session where a character could die and then, well, that player is going to be the one making the McDonald's run, or they're going to be sitting on the couch for a few hours playing video games until that session ends. This was a show with an announced cast, an actress who has her fans. The return of Vesper to the story was more or less a given. It was the how that was going to be surprising, and boy was it. Because they ended up taking advantage of a session that Vesper's actress, Christina V, had to miss by saying that Vesper was away backing up her memories and hard drive and personality and everything in case something like this happened. She spends about 2 sessions in Alpha's body, and that reminds me of something I forgot to mention earlier. The third advantage of that brand new time ship is that it came with its very own robotic assistant in the Alpha series with Alpha 55. Anyway, Vesper spends about 2 sessions in Alpha's body, even going into battle with the Rangers in Alpha's body, before she gets a brand new body they made, which if I remember right, they said it looked exactly like the old body. But even her revival, which a lot of people would say was cheesy and just, well, I guess they had to do that, didn't they? Ended up being heartbreakingly amazing. At first, Vesper only remembers that she was the Black Hyperforce Ranger, due to a really bad roll where she wasn't even told what she was rolling for. Later on, primarily due to convenience, she remembers more about the team and her experiences and stuff. Not her death, but she knows and understands that she had died. Then, when she takes over her new body, she regains all of her memories, including her death, and the experience is so painful and traumatic for her that she ends up begging the Time Force Rangers to take those memories away. Christina V is a voice actress, perhaps best known right now for her role on Ladybug and Cat Noir, and her acting chops were really showcased in this, portraying a sad, emotional woman who used humor and goofiness as a shield to not let anybody come really close to her. Her close friendship with Eddie evolving into a romantic connection was really one of the bedrocks of the show's plot, and Christina and Eddie played off each other tremendously. The final core ranger is Chloe, the Pink Ranger. Chloe is a Robin Hood character, a thief with a heart of gold, and that seems to be her primary motivation at first, as she tells Jack that she was trying to break into the evidence room to liberate technology that Time Force was keeping as evidence, but really just sitting on when it could be helping other people. However, Chloe's story is far more personal and painful than that, as it turns out that the real reason she was trying to break into the evidence room was to examine Time Force's evidence of their investigation into the death of both of her parents. Time Force never actually officially declared them dead, instead declaring that the two were missing in action as Time Force officers. And it turned out that they were far from dead, as you may have already heard me mention. It turns out that Chloe's parents broke the Time Force rules by traveling into the future for personal reasons, wanting to check on what became of their daughter Chloe. They found her as an unchallenged layabout. In fact, I'd imagine that they found that most of the universe was like this, because this somehow leads to the two of them being convinced that good had a far too easy time becoming the status quo in the universe, and evil never really had a fair chance. I mean, we're talking about a couple of true neutral characters here on the D&D chart. Maybe chaotic neutrals, because what this does is convinces them to hatch a plan where they would kidnap Zordon and prevent him from sacrificing himself so that good and evil would fight on a truly even battlefield. Like Vesper, Chloe also didn't let anyone else get close to her, but instead of using non-sequitur humor as a shield, Chloe tended to use a super bubbly, giddy, almost brainless personality that was hiding who she really was inside, getting obsessed at first with candy and eventually burritos, which ended up becoming the official food of the Hyperforce team. But whereas Vesper really just wasn't sure who she could trust after finding out that her parents had lied to her about being an android, Chloe was really just hiding the pain of the loss of her parents and not wanting to lose anyone else by getting close to them again. An interesting thing about Chloe is just how powerful she ended up becoming. She was really the strongest ranger on the team by the end. A little boost from Santa Claus, again, long story, ended up leading to her becoming the ranger with the single largest boost to any particular stat, an eventual +3 to her stealth. And Chloe is the first female ranger to ever receive a battleizer. That was done by random chance, a literal and figurative roll of the die, but it was still awesome. And as a matter of fact, this reminds me of something I forgot to mention with Vesper. A short time after that, Vesper, another female ranger, also got a battleizer, becoming the Black Sentinel Ranger. Chloe's final arc involves becoming more assertive and sure of herself, wrapped up when we see her confront Marv and tell him that she will always do what she thinks is right, regardless of what he has to say about it, as well as finding her father alive, and then finding out that he has been solely responsible for all of the pain and difficulty she's had to endure in her entire life. Her performance in the finale is an absolute tour de force, going from painful vulnerability to a rage that channels the very wind itself. Speaking of her performance, Chloe was portrayed by Megan Camarena, aka Strawberry17, a YouTuber primarily focused on video games, but she does vlogs and crafting and other things like that as well. For me, she just beats out Andre as the breakout performer of this series. Chloe was just amazing to watch in every single session that she was a part of, and Megan just dominated most of the scenes that Chloe was a part of. And I'll finish up the Rangers with one that I've mentioned once or twice already, but there's really not all that much to say about: Joe, Marv's brother, the Time Force Silver and Hyperforce Green Rangers. Joe's character is a case of a live RPG that airs once a week, rolling with the punches. At first, Joe wasn't even really a character so much as a character motivation for Marv. But then, Ranger fans started eagerly asking Hyper RPG when we were going to get a 6th Ranger for the Hyperforce team, and for whatever reason, this was something that Hyper RPG had not planned or budgeted for. They were only going to go with 5 Rangers. I suppose we got that on Dino Thunder, but still. When they decided to go ahead and give us a 6th Ranger, they decided to do more with the character of Joe. If they don't get that push from the fans, I honestly think that Joe stays dead and just acts as character motivation for Marv. Instead, the character started to grow, as we find out that he was a secret agent for the Time Force. But while we've had Rangers that have been pretty different from their core teams, and many fans, myself included, were absolutely cool with the idea of Hyperforce's 6th Ranger actually being an original Time Force Ranger, it was really felt that he needed to be a part of the team in a proper sense. So, Joe's Silver Time Force Morpher ends up getting taken by the Alliance and destroyed, and Jen decides to grant him a new Morpher, making him a proper part of the Hyperforce Rangers as the Green Ranger. There really wasn't a lot of time to characterize Joe on his own, but we do see him to be a very brave officer willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish the mission, and also very encouraging of his brother Marv. Looking for an actor to play Marv's brother? How about Marv's actor's brother? Yes, it was Yoshi Sudarso, best known as Koda, the Blue Dino Charge Ranger, and in fact reprising that role in a cameo during Ninja Steel this season, that played Joe. In fact, that gave him a really nice chance to get a little revenge on Peter, flipping the script of the Power Morphicon Ninja Steel cast reveal, surprising Peter by revealing Yoshi. Yoshi did a fine job as Joe, but he really didn't have all that much to work with. Again, this character's very existence and ongoing presence in the story was a surprise. Alright, the Rangers are out of the way, let's turn it over to the villains. The villains were led by Thrax, but for 23 sessions we only knew of him as the Alliance leader, and that mysteriousness really limited what they could actually do with his character. He was just sort of dark and quiet, though very quick to get angry. It wasn't until they actually visited the era of Operation Overdrive that we saw him start to slip into what we knew of as Thrax. Then, right after that, when we learn about Mr. Ashford, at that point really just a man in a lab coat that we don't know anything about, and we see Thrax capitulate to him, any mysteriousness and fear of the character just dried up in an instant. It's not like he was the worst villain ever in this instance of the character, but far from the most impressive either. Scorpina, we really already knew a lot about from the show, and honestly not much changed here. A vicious warrior that was determined and prideful. She was really the muscle of the group, and I have to admit it was really cool to have a female villain as the muscle. She just didn't get to do very much. She enchanted Eddie in her first appearance, and after that I really don't remember much about her until the very end, her fight with Vesper, which was pretty fierce, and then her supposed death as Wes and Vesper toss her out the back of the ship into hyperspace. The final member of the villains trio was Velkanos, an original character for this story. His origins are kind of unclear, actually. To my memory, he was basically a monster created by Lord Zed that the Alliance leader ended up having Scorpina recruit into their ranks. Given his name, he obviously had control over rocks and lava, but really, his entire purpose in the story, even up until about the end, was to get the magic clay from Finster and be the team's monster maker. And not even really then, they usually just ended up using monsters that were related to the show's history in some way. Really, he was just the father of the putties. Those villains, as well as many other non-player characters that really weren't worth mentioning all that much, were portrayed by Malika Lim Eubank, the Game Master. This was Malika's first experience at GMing a game on her own, and she did an absolutely excellent job. Malika had a very upbeat attitude about Power Rangers, operating under a mindset that the Rangers always win. The question is just how we get there. We saw a stark departure from that whenever her now husband Zach took over the GMing duties, as he did a couple of times. Zach is more experienced as a GM, not that Malika's inexperience led to any problems necessarily, just that there was a difference in experience level. And more importantly to this story, Zach did not care whatsoever if the Rangers won or lost. It all depended on the dice. Although, as I'm sure he would point out, the one time that a Ranger actually died, Malika was the one GMing the game, and she even rolled the dice herself. Lastly, I want to talk about what impact Hyperforce has had on the franchise, because this little RPG show that aired on Twitch in the middle of the week, you could see that as something that was just kind of tucked into the corner of the fandom and was quickly forgotten. However, the impact of Hyperforce is clear, mainly in seeing how these characters have moved on to other media. The Hyperforce Rangers were later seen in the pages of the Boom Studios comic books, helping many other Rangers defeat Lord Draken. And that actually makes sense, since the Hyperforce Rangers themselves paid a visit to Lord Draken's dimension during their own travels. And the newest step in that arena is the addition of Jack D. Thomas, Hyperforce Yellow, to the mobile fighting game Power Rangers Legacy Wars. And this is what I hinted at earlier that I was going to mention, because I have to give Enway a lot of credit for putting Jack into the game as a big, solid, just tank of a character. I mentioned liking Jack's character so much because he was a big, heavy guy in the Power Rangers universe, and Enway really honored that. Both of these cases, Legacy Wars and the comics featuring Hyperforce, does the same thing. Firmly establishes Power Rangers Hyperforce as part of the Power Rangers multiverse. No mentions of Hyperforce on the TV show just yet. However, if you want to yank at a straw a little bit here, the recent anniversary episode of Super Ninja Steel, Dimensions in Danger, mentions a device, transportals, that we first saw on the pages of the Boom Studio comic books, and the Boom Studios comic books acknowledge Hyperforce, so this is something I'm getting really tired of having to say, although truthfully this will probably be the last time that I have to say it, at least for a while. There is still no official word on a second season of Power Rangers Hyperforce. Hasbro seems to have embraced it. The actors appear at conventions and even have their own panels as representatives of part of the Power Rangers franchise. So I'm not really sure what exactly the holdup is, but like you all I can do is hope that it happens. And wow, now it finally is over. That didn't really hit me so hard last time when I reviewed the finale because I knew that I was still making this video. But now, here I am at the last Hyperforce video that I knew I was going to be making. Now, it's like Wes says, the future isn't written in stone. Hasbro might greenlight more Hyperforce, either as a Hyper RPG, either as an RPG, or in some other format. Or this may truly be the end. Either way, this show was amazing for 25 3-hour sessions, and I loved almost every single one of them. They did a Mystic Force session that was really slow and talky and didn't feature a lot of action. That would have to be my least favorite of them, although I even gave that one a 3, so hey. If we get a second season of Power Rangers Hyperforce, you have my guarantee right now that I will review it. If not, it was a fun ride. And thus concludes my last Power Rangers Hyperforce video for a while. Make sure to like the video by clicking that like button right down below, that big thumbs up. In the comments below, there's 2 things I would like you heroes to do. 1, just discuss your thoughts on Power Rangers Hyperforce. Favorite character, favorite session, favorite era of Ranger history that they visited, etc., etc. Also, hashtag Hyperforce Season 2. Let people know in the comments just how badly you want to see and would support a second season of Hyperforce. I know from a little bit of personal experience that the folks at Hasbro pay a lot of attention to review videos of Hyperforce like this series. So they can see down in the comments that a lot of my viewers, my heroes, are interested in Hyperforce continuing. So do that down in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel to see all of my videos, and make sure your notifications are set up so you get notified of whenever I post brand new videos. I'm still reviewing Power Rangers Super Ninja Steel, and I'll be reviewing Power Rangers Beast Morphers. I'm reviewing the Boom Studios Power Rangers comic books, and I have a couple of other things in the works that I'll be telling you folks about in time. And if you really enjoyed my Power Rangers Hyperforce reviews, as well as the other work I do on this channel, and you wanted to toss me a little bit of financial support, you can head over to digitaltipjar.com/orangerangervid, toss a little tip change in that jar, and I'd be grateful for anything that lands inside. For what hopefully isn't the last time, but may be, heroes, may the power protect you, and go Hyperforce. She sends this ragtag team of Time Force cadets and one Time Force beat cop. However, this was one of those cases where the villain that we followed through Marv was driven for most of the season by his apparent It was the death of the Black Ranger, Vesper, that really solidified Marv as to accepting the leadership role of the team. I don't know what that means. But it was something just with simple character notes and just, what's the term I'm trying to think of? Informed character attributes. Jack, Deal Good Thomas, serial number 1993, Omega, now I want to say Time Force. Later on, mainly due to convenience, she ends up remembering more, including the knowledge that she had died, but not knowing really, gosh darn it. And I'll finish up the Rangers with one that I've mentioned a couple times already, but really haven't had much. Yes, it was Yoshi Sudarso, known as and I had mentioned that I was going to mention. You can head on over to digitaltipjar.com, or I think